If the U.S. goes to war with Venezuela, there's some downside risk to that from the U.S. perspective. There's an infinite supply of all commodities. It's just a matter of price. China will begin to assert itself more and more in various parts of the Middle East, and the U.S. might put up a sort of a bit of a fight, but not really. And if it does take effective control over Venezuela, already has effective control over Argentina, it hurts the Chinese.
Venezuela just got hit by the Trump administration in what they call an attack on a big facility. Some economists I've spoken to are calling this literally acts of war. We'll find out what's next for the region as a whole and energy, of course, with our guest today, Doomberg, head writer of the Doomberg substack. Don't let his friendly avatar fool you. He is an expert on all things geopolitics and the energy markets, and it's always a good time to have Doomberg back on. Welcome back, Doomberg. Good to see you.
David, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and all that jazz, and great to be back on with you. Yes. And we were just chatting before you hit record that there's no shortage of things to talk about just because it's a holiday, so let's get right into it.
The Trump administration, like I mentioned today, quote unquote, knocked out a Venezuelan facility, a move that would be a major escalation in U.S. military strikes to counter alleged drug trafficking by the South American country. Now, let's just set the stage for the audience who may be away for the holidays. So over the last couple of weeks, Trump has, I guess, embargoed, I don't know if you want to call it that, but the Trump administration has instituted a naval blockade around Venezuela. Trump has called it on Truth Social on the first day that this will be the largest naval armada that South America has ever seen. I believe it's something like 25% of the U.S. Navy, I think, please correct me if I've misquoted those numbers, is now in that region. And like I've said today, major escalation. They've already captured a few oil tankers coming in and out, or attempting to come in and out. So help us set the stage, Doomberg. What has been happening so far per your research? And what does this major escalation today mean for the region?
I must confess, David, that I find the whole Venezuela affair to be quite a puzzle. Embargoing a country is an act of war. And if this report that you've pulled up from NBC News is true, that would also be an act of war. Congress has not declared war on Venezuela. And the pretense around the drug cartel seems rather flimsy, considering how much more activity occurs in Colombia and Mexico and so on. And we wrote a piece recently about the sort of the relative silence of China and Russia on this issue, who are, at least on paper, significant allies of Venezuela. Not quite sure what's going on. You are correct to say that it is a very large armada. Our research indicates it's not quite as large as what was in the Caribbean during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but 60 years ago might as well have been forever years ago.
Yeah.
It seems like there's something else going on. Whenever there's weird stuff like this that we just can't understand, history teaches us that there's some deeper meaning to it all. I can't say that I know what it is today. I will say I find that the oil market's response to all this to be relatively docile. Here we are, WTI at 58 as we're recording this.
Yes.
To be fair, Venezuela only exports about 600,000 barrels a day of oil now. It's down substantially from its peak. About 2/3 of that goes to China. 1/3 goes to the U.S. And so,
well, I'm just going to pull this up before we continue. Venezuela had the world's largest proven crude oil reserves in 2023. So maybe it's not about the current production; it's about the reserves that the Trump administration is after. Maybe.
Yeah, those reserves are also quite amenable to refining in the U.S. Gulf Coast fleet. In fact, some would argue that fleet was built to process Venezuelan heavy crude. Venezuela is a basket case. There's no doubt about it. Maduro probably stole the last election. All those things are probably true. And there's no doubt that there is a significant aspect of the drug trade that is involved with Venezuela. And the administration would say, the gangs and the immigration and all that stuff are acts of state-sponsored terrorism. And so I'm sure there's a legal justification for all this. But yeah, you've pulled up the chart of oil here. This doesn't strike us as a chart that is pricing in a full-blown war in the Caribbean. So one of our pet theories is that this is, in fact, a larger war against drugs and money laundering and the banks in the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands. And, there's a world where you could view Trump being at war with the deep state and British intelligence. And, we've read those theories, not convinced of them yet, but they make at least as much sense as out of nowhere, we're going to war with Venezuela. So we'll see. This strike is, I think, that you just pulled up is relatively new. We're recording this as the news is breaking. Remains to be seen what that strike entailed. Was it a missile? I don't know. It's breaking as we're talking. But if we do go to war, if the U.S. goes to war with Venezuela in a full-blown conflict, there's some downside risk to that from the U.S. perspective. A lot of jungles in Venezuela and guerrilla warfare campaign seems eminently possible. At the same time, perhaps Trump is just being Trump and dialing up the pressure in the hopes that Maduro resigns, and they could have a regime change without too much of a kinetic conflict. But again, as I started this answer on this topic, we find the whole thing to be quite mysterious.
I like how you called it an act of war. Well, an act of war implies, I guess, an act of aggression against the entire nation state. And so one can expect some retaliation from the entire nation state, not just cartels, right? What is Venezuela going to do about this, do you think?
I don't think there's much Venezuela can do about it, at least not as it pertains to the naval blockade. They don't have much in the way of a navy or an air force, certainly not compared to the power of the strike force that the U.S. has assembled in the region. And if you're Maduro, do you really want to poke the bear in that way, in what would be a sort of symbolic escalation that Trump would undoubtedly pounce on, and Congress might get involved and give Trump approval? We note with interest that Trump refused to proactively take away Trump's approval just before the holidays, which I suppose you could read Congress has indirectly given its blessing to this whole affair. Long ago, the U.S. stopped following the Constitution in that Congress has delegated to the president essentially the power to declare war without really declaring it. This only accelerated after 9/11 and the whole, terrorism laws that came into place in the aftermath of that. And so I suppose it's quaint to assume that Congress should be the body in the U.S. constitutional republic that declares war, but that's no longer the case.
Right. And the article here from NBC states that the administration has ramped up pressure on Venezuela in recent months. In October, Trump confirmed that he had authorized the CIA to take unspecified action in Venezuela, an unusual acknowledgement about covert action. So as you'll recall, a couple of weeks ago, I think last month, the Trump administration has declared Venezuela a terrorist state. And that has justified, I guess, in their minds, their current action against the country. Now, the bottom line for the energy market, are you saying that because Venezuela doesn't currently export very much oil, that even an embargo would not materially impact the global oil supply? Is that correct? So, in our piece, Silent Allies, we mentioned China's relative silence in this regard, and we've since done some more digging. I mean, the world is awash in physical oil. There's a huge armada of Venezuelan crude ships sitting near China today, and because of sanctions and stuff, that having some trouble offloading them. We wrote an earlier piece about how China has been buying an extra 1 million barrels a day of oil over and above what it needs, which presumably is just going straight into its strategic reserves. And there's a lot of flex in the system right now. So a disruption of some of Venezuela's 600,000 barrels a day of exports could probably be handled. Oil is off its lows. It almost touched our equilibrium price of $55 a barrel a couple of weeks ago, back up in the high 50s today. But that just seems like market noise compared to a major kinetic escalation in the Caribbean. Having said that, such a campaign would probably be contained. I don't think Guyana is going to suffer from all of this, or Argentina with Vaca Muerta, or Brazil, which is growing its output. So there's plenty of oil in the world. And I guess it's testimony to just how plentiful oil is that you have this and frictions in the Middle East, apparently Netanyahu coming over to try to convince Trump to allow Israel to attack Iran again. Looks like there's not going to be much in the way of peace between Russia and Ukraine. And despite all of these, what would historically be geopolitical tailwinds for the price of oil, here we are down in the high 50s. You already know why people hold gold. It's because it's real money. But what if your gold could do more than just sit in a vault? Well, that's where our sponsor today, Monetary Metals, comes in. They offer a way for you to earn a yield on your gold paid in physical gold. Through their leasing marketplace, you can earn up to 4% yield per year in gold. Instead of paying storage fees, your gold actually works for you. And because that yield is paid in gold, not cash, your stack grows no matter what the dollar is doing. Thousands of clients already earn monthly interest in gold and silver through monetary metals, and the numbers just keep climbing. So don't just hold gold. Start earning real gold on your gold today. Go to monetary-metals.com/Lin, link down below, or scan the QR code here. Put your gold to work soon. Well, let's move on to talk about oil next year. Venezuela aside, what would be the major drivers of demand and supply dynamics into 2026, where perhaps Venezuela and South America remain top of mind for you?
Yeah, I think, again, our view is that the markets are incredibly well supplied. We note with interest, major trading houses calling for a super glut next year. That's probably a sign that we're near a local bottom. Right now, we would say, again, I've been on your show many times over the past couple of years and have always stated that our equilibrium price for a barrel of oil is $55 a barrel, which is a number we extract by looking at the liquefied natural gas markets. Made that call with you when oil was in the 70s, and here we are, 2 years later. It touched 55 a couple of weeks ago, right around our equilibrium price. We wouldn't get too excited either way, of course. Like the old Wall Street adage, if you set a target price and the stock reaches it, then it's probably a hold. I'd say, all things considered, things are pretty well settled here. When we look across the entire energy complex, of course, you can't just look at oil in isolation. Natural gas is still dirt cheap in the US. Landed LNG in Europe is under $10 per million BTU. Coal is doing nothing at $110 a ton for Newcastle coal. So nothing in the markets today screams a big pivot higher or lower. Nice, cheap, low energy is a good foundation for reasonable economic growth, all things being equal. Of course, all things are never equal, but that's kind of where we are today.
Pulling up the oil chart once more, Doomberg, is there a reason why geopolitical escalations this year have not contributed to sustainably higher oil prices? As you recall, several spikes throughout the year, like June, for example, when escalations around Gaza have occurred, but the geopolitical risk premium did not stay for very long. It fell shortly after. And of course, the general trend was down. In fact, oil is down somewhere around 20 to 26% year to date, depending on your time frame. And so the question that I want to ask is, are geopolitics still important for global energy prices?
Not when you have this much of it. Again, there's this whole peak cheap oil crowd, and we've talked about this before. And I don't know how much data they need to revise their case. But as I said, look, even when the 12-day war happened, which I think is responsible for one of these spikes between Iran and Israel, I should say. All things being equal, the physical markets dictate, supply and demand dictate, and there's just a lot of it, a lot more of it coming online. And there's engine switching into LNG and to natural gas and to natural gas liquids. And, the whole hydrocarbon complex is arbitraging its way, grinding its way lower as we predicted. And so if you just go all the way to the left of that chart and you draw an arrow from top to bottom, you could see what's going on. And now I think, again, we're not perma-bearish. There's a price where oil gets interesting. I think if it goes much lower than here, you'll see supply pullback because, again, once you go below equilibrium price, producers are less incentivized to drill. And so I think things are pretty balanced. I would say, if you ask me to predict 2026 price trends, I'd say, the best piece of data we have are current prices.
Do you think that sustainably lower oil prices, at least for the foreseeable future, could be a boon for economic growth? Or does it perhaps signal as a leading indicator slowing economic growth? Which would it be?
Chicken or the egg, pardon the pun. But I would say all things being equal, cheap energy is bullish for economic development. Sure. And, look at the AI boom in the U.S. Natural gas still, Henry Hub today, $4.50 per million BTU. Negative prices spot in the Permian still. We're just swimming in natural gas, which is a huge benefit for the U.S. So you're seeing this boom in data center construction, this shortage of gas turbines to produce power from that gas. Innovations happening to try to find other ways to make electricity from natural gas that don't involve a gas turbine. And so lots of activity going on there. Of course, the classic K-shaped economy. If you're a tech mogul slash billionaire, you had a very good 2025. If you're on the lower end of the economic ladder, inflation is probably biting you a little bit. So, all things being equal, I would say we would much rather see cheap energy prices than expensive energy prices because, super spikes in energy cause recessions. So the opposite of that, at least directionally, is normally true.
I want to spend some time to talk about foreign policy objectives for 2026 that may impact energy markets worldwide. There's several fronts that Trump has to contend with. Of course, there's the ongoing war in Ukraine that hasn't been resolved yet. Iran-Israel tensions have not been resolved. If anything, they've escalated since the beginning of last year, or this year, rather. China competition remains top of mind. NATO and the pressure on European NATO allies mounts for them to fund their own defenses against Russia and other foreign hostilities. And now, seemingly, a new front has opened up with Venezuela. So what do you think should be Trump's priority, or what do you think will be Trump's priorities for 2026?
It kind of depends who he's talked to last. It's kind of how Trump is. I mean, his national security strategy document would indicate that the Western Hemisphere is a top priority. That document was pretty amazing. It kind of hung Europe out to dry. Stated openly that peace in Ukraine and normalizing relationships with Russia was in the U.S.'s strategic interest. Really remarkable things for a president of the United States to write, given the context of the past 5 years. That being said, we're very careful to partition between what the sort of mega side of Trump's administration wants and what the rest of Washington, D.C. wants. And, we have a mental model internally that we think is pretty operative, which is if, and this is a hypothetical, and it's our best guess, if there was a secret ballot today, 80% of Congress would vote to impeach or remove Trump. There's no such thing as a DC Republican establishment. There's the DC uniparty war machine. And then some people on the right, MAGA, and some people on the left, the Bernie Sanders and AOCs of the world. The vast blob in the middle, neocon, forever war, that's real. They exist. They don't support Trump. Europeans don't like Trump. So, on the one hand, you could say there's a fracture between the U.S. and European allies as it pertains to NATO, but not really. There's a fracture between Trump and NATO. There's a huge proportion of Washington, D.C. that thinks Trump is dead wrong and is acting against the president's interest and whispering to their European friends that don't worry, 2028, this too shall pass. And so there's a tug of war going on in the Trump administration against the establishment in DC. But, when I see sort of partisan conservatives on Twitter lamenting the fact that the filibuster isn't being broken, of course they're not going to break the filibuster. They don't want Trump's agenda to get passed. I mean, to think that the Republicans, quote unquote, control the Senate and the House is to be totally naive about how Washington really works these days. And
do you think that new alliances can be formed against the U.S. and their allies next year, if you had to speculate?
Well, I think you're seeing, the BRICS alliance becoming ever closer, contrary to Trump's prognostications on the matter. I think China and Russia are growing much closer militarily, technologically, certainly as it pertains to commodities. And, one thing you did mention in your preamble to this part of the interview is the naval exercises that China is doing today around Taiwan, which I think are pretty dangerous and pretty escalatory. If China were to make a move against Taiwan, with NATO tied down in Ukraine, and as you say, a fair chunk of the U.S. Blue Ocean Navy tied up in the Caribbean, now would seem pretty opportune time to make such a move. Not saying they will. Our base case is that China's objective is to sort of swallow Taiwan whole without a kinetic conflict in the same way they did Hong Kong. But we'll see. Anytime we see these sort of belligerent commentaries by the Chinese, Navy officials and basically a dry run to imposing an embargo on Taiwan, it's not positive. It's certainly not bullish for peace. That's for sure.
Speaking of peace and war, this is from the news earlier this week. Iran says it's now in a full-scale war with U.S., Israel, and Europe. Iran's president said on Saturday the country is facing a full-scale confrontation with the U.S., Israel, and Europe, describing the pressure campaign against Tehran is more complex and damaging than the Iran-Iraq war. Oil analysts and news commentators are quoting this as possibly one of the reasons for why oil went up 2% today when the rest of the market is down. There's also Zelensky and Trump. Zelensky said progress has been made at the talks on Sunday, noted we much appreciate the progress achieved by American and Ukrainian teams in recent weeks. Well, let's follow up on Ukraine, Russia in a few weeks. Let's see if actual progress is going to be made. But focusing on Iran for now, does this statement come as a surprise at all? I mean, does the world care at this point that they formally announced they're in a full-scale confrontation? I'm not even sure that they are, but I'll let you comment on that.
Sure. I think, much can be lost in translation. I think what Iran was, the leaders of Iran were trying to say, the Iranian president was trying to say, is that there's a sustained, multi-pronged effort by Israel, the U.S., and Europe to relentlessly pursue regime change in Iran. I would say, what we would call full-scale confrontation would involve kinetic conflict, missiles, bombs, decapitation strikes, like we saw in the 12-day war earlier this year. Our view is that, we've seen these stories that Netanyahu is in Florida today as we're recording this to try to get Trump's quote-unquote permission to launch another attack on Iran. Saw other reports that it's more about Lebanon. Who knows? Unless the U.S. has suddenly stumbled upon a massive new inventory of air defense missiles, or there's some new laser technology that we're unaware of that Israel feels confident it can shoot down a barrage of incoming Iranian missiles, we would find it surprising if Israel would attack Iran so soon after it suffered pretty substantial damage to critical infrastructure. It's not written about much in the West, something we followed, of course, very closely. But the Haifa refinery in Israel was damaged very badly by Iranian missiles with targeting capabilities, ballistic missiles. That refinery was offline for like 5 months, substantially damaged. You never hear about it. But, Israel's a very small place. And as we've written and talked about before, there aren't that many targets that could be knocked out that would make Israel essentially unlivable. So sure, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon yet, at least that we know of, and everyone assumes Israel does. But it's not like Iran is without ability to counterpunch. And we suspect that Russia and China have been busy rearming Iran and helping out with its air defense systems and strengthening its internal security so that this whole, intelligence failure that led to the decapitation strike against Iranian leaders won't happen again. Who knows? But we would be skeptical of missiles launching between Iran and Israel anytime soon. We could be wrong. We hope we're right. But we'll see.
Does it strike you as rather odd that the war in Ukraine is still ongoing despite several attempts at Zelensky and the U.S. at making a peace deal over the last month? I mean, Putin's met with the U.S. There's some theories that there are certain actors within the West that want or have a vested interest in having the war continue. How do you read this?
I mean, the two sides are just so far apart. We've never assumed that peace could be negotiated. I mean, full credit to Trump for trying. I mean, the U.S. could end the war tomorrow if it really wanted to. I don't think Trump thinks he has the political support to do that. It could cut off military intelligence to Ukraine. That would be it. I mean, look, these battlefield targeting, in the line of contact and also in deep in Russia, this is all facilitated by U.S. satellites and U.S. military intelligence. And it's not like the European allies have anything comparable to what the U.S. can provide. And for a while, Trump did cut off military intelligence for a few days to Ukraine. And you remember that's when Zelensky belatedly and half-heartedly agreed to a ceasefire a few months ago. This is all, many headlines ago. But if Trump is sort of trying to thread the needle, because if he were to cut off military support, I think, he would be fighting a rearguard action in Washington. The Lindsey Grahams of the world wouldn't be too happy with him. And Zelensky's just, between Zelensky and Putin, they're just miles apart. And so we've always just assumed that there's only one way this war ends, and that's with military victory and imposition of terms by the victor. We suspect that victor will be Russia. Many people believe that. I think that's the base case now. It's not controversial to say that. But Ukraine was It's very difficult to lose wars. One of the reasons why you shouldn't get into them. And politically in Kiev, I don't think Zelensky is capable of making the types of compromises that would satisfy the Russians. And if you're a Ukrainian, you would probably say he shouldn't, because, Russia is the invader and morality is on the side of the Ukrainians. Of course, morality doesn't win wars. Bombs and missiles and rifles and soldiers do. But we shall see. We don't think, look, I think given his full, degrees of freedom, Trump would have wanted this war to end a long time ago. He wants to do business with Russia. Russia's got enormous resources, rare earths, oil, gas, coal, fertilizer, agricultural goods, high technology, low technology. Russia is a very large economy, and there's a huge, look, ExxonMobil wants to get back into Russia. There's no secret about that. There's huge collaboration potential in the Arctic. All of this sounds foreign to people who have been sort of fed by the propaganda that, the world is a certain way and will always be that way. The last two times Russia and Germany fought a war, which side was the U.S. on, after all? But here we are. Trump, we think, has limited political flexibility. Putin has been sort of participating, but not really. Anything that buys Russia more time, I think, it serves Putin's interest, because they feel like they're just going to win a grinding war of attrition. And so that's where we are. We don't think there'll be some breakthrough, not with Zelensky in charge. And if Zaluzhny, the current ambassador to the UK for Ukraine, comes back, he won't be in a position to negotiate a settlement either.
So it doesn't look good for the Western allies right now, is what I think we can glean from this. But let's just take the assumption that Trump doesn't want to end the war in Ukraine's favor tomorrow. They could invade Russia, let's hypothetically speaking, and do that, right? But that's not going to happen. So let's suppose that we have this ongoing stalemate, or perhaps Trump cuts off further military support to Ukraine. Well, that would basically mean that the Western allies have to admit failure for their support in this war. What do you think Europe is going to do about this?
Europe is desperate to see the war continue. I should say the European Union and the European Commission seem determined to see the war continue. And I think for good reason, because if defeat were to occur and be recognized, the current batch of political leaders in Europe would be swept out of power. So Macron, Starmer, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, Friedrich Merz, Donald Tusk, all of them would have to go. They know it. And so here they are, lending Ukraine another $90 billion of 90 billion euros of money they don't have. What Trump has done and kept to is cut off most of the financial support to Ukraine, which is actually the most devastating thing that he's done to Ukraine. Don't forget Biden, shoveled tens of billions, scores of billions of U.S. taxpayer money into the Ukrainian effort, and Ukraine is insolvent. And if Europe had not, committed to that $90 billion loan, the war would have ended rather quickly. And so we'll see. But it's a tough situation. Look at the greatest victims in all of this, of course, are the people of Ukraine, who the country has been shattered by this whole war. Again, wars are terrible. We're against all of them, and they're always a rich person's racket.
An interesting other article I want to bring to your attention. This is also from oilprice.com. Iraq has become a battleground for China and Western oil giants. Iraq is apparently back in the news. It's at a crucial tipping point in its history, the author writes. The past few months especially have seen a surge in activity from Western firms looking to re-enter the country's oil and gas sector. Have you been following this country at all?
Yeah, Doomberg? Sure. Yeah, of course. I think as the U.S. energy production continues to grow and it turns its attention to the Western Hemisphere, the importance of the Middle East to the U.S. can only fade, and the importance to of the Middle East to the Chinese can only grow, of course, because China, being a massive oil importer, relies on flows from the Middle East to satisfy its huge supply-demand gap. And so I think, thermodynamically, the direction of travel is that China will begin to assert itself more and more in various parts of the Middle East, and the U.S. might put up sort of a bit of a fight, but not really, because it's got plenty to do in the Western Hemisphere, plenty of oil of its own. And if it does take effective control over Venezuela, already has effective control over Argentina through the bailout of Malay, there's a huge amount of oil and gas here. And so what does Iraq's hydrocarbon resources really matter to the U.S., except, I suppose, to try to disrupt them for the sake of disrupting them so that it hurts the Chinese?
I want to end on one final piece that actually you wrote, and this has to do with Trump and their supposed interest in the nuclear fusion business. I'll let you summarize what you found here.
Look, I mean, last week we saw this crazy deal. Trump Media, which
Yes.
owns Truth Social, which generates $1 million in revenue a quarter and has about $40 million a quarter in operating expenses, merged with a privately held VC-backed fusion company, TAE Technologies. And it must be said that fusion is one of our pet peeves. It's a fake solution to problems that don't exist, as we outlined in the piece. It's one of these things that sounds like it should be really cool and should be in the national interest, when in reality, it's simply not needed. And it's always going to be 20, 30, 40 years away. Why it would be that a fledgling social media company with the president's name attached to it should make for great synergies with a loss-making fusion company that admits it's at least probably 5 to 10 years away from even developing a fusion reactor that generates more energy than it takes to run it. Well, we all probably know what it's really all about, which is the creation of a meme stock. And, it's hard not to be cynical when you see such things. We kind of took this deal to task in this piece, had a little fun with it too, of course. But it's a sign of the times for sure.
Why? Let's rewind here. Why is it that it's fixing a problem that doesn't exist? I mean, we do have a need for unlimited energy. I mean, that could fix a lot of the world's problems.
Yeah, we have unlimited energy today. It's called fission. And the two problems that fusion purports to solve are meltdown risk and quote unquote nuclear waste. The latest reactor designs on the shelf, build ready for fission reactors, have all but eliminated meltdown risk. It's not like we're going to build the reactor design that 3 Mile Island had, 40 years ago. And even there, the one meltdown in the U.S. fleet, partial meltdown in the U.S. fleet, nobody got injured. Radiation was contained. It's not the end of the world. Since that time, the U.S. nuclear reactor fleet, with old and new designs, has operated 4,000 reactor years without a major safety incident. Every heavy industry on Earth would kill to have a safety record like that. Meltdown risk isn't a real risk, and nuclear waste should be thought of as partially spent fuel that future generations of engineers will be happy to inherit. The propaganda around nuclear is so thick and so misleading that it's incredibly frustrating. So fusion, of course, the only reason why you would pursue fusion is because it, quote, has no meltdown risk and doesn't produce, radioactive nuclear waste. Well, neither of those are real problems. Fusion doesn't actually exist. I mean, fusion reactions occur, can be made to occur, but net energy producing fusion reactors are a long ways off, let alone commercially viable ones. We view fusion as a giant distraction from fission. China is building dozens of reactors at a time because that technology is more than good enough for what humanity needs. The U.S. should be doing the same. To Trump's credit, on the other side of the coin, he is trying to uncork a nuclear fission renaissance with the help of the Japanese. But this merger, to the extent that it propagates the false narrative that there's something chronically wrong with fission, that fusion is both needed and cheap and just on the cusp of being economically viable, that's just wrong. It's deceptive, and it hurts the existing technology that should be implemented post-haste.
But there is a limited amount of economically recoverable uranium in the world, is there not?
No, there's an infinite supply of uranium. I mean, again, by the way, you could just take all the nuclear waste and reprocess it. So when you run a fuel rod through a reactor in the U.S. and it comes out, quote, spent, 95% of the embodied energy is still there. The U.S. doesn't reprocess it today for a variety of reasons, economic, and there's a small a proliferation risk because of some plutonium that gets produced. but this is all manageable. There's no shortage of uranium. We're writing a piece, a couple of pieces from now. It's in the hopper about Saskatchewan, the province of Saskatchewan in Canada. They have enormous uranium reserves up there. It's some of the richest, highest quality uranium reserves on the planet. Our view is that there's an infinite supply of all commodities. It's just a matter of price. And for nuclear power, the price of uranium is almost irrelevant. At current uranium prices, fuel costs to operate a nuclear reactor are a fraction of a penny per kilowatt hour, effectively free. Fuel doesn't mean that nuclear is free. Nuclear is expensive with all the safety issues and labor and all that other stuff. But fuel itself is relatively free. If the price of uranium tripled tomorrow, you'd see an avalanche of new supply over the next 18 months, and nobody would notice it in their power bills.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time today. So that was a good gamut of topics we ran through. Tell us about where we can find you, and importantly, what you're working on this week and into the new year that we can expect to read.
You bet. Doomberg.com and classicsreadaloud.com, of course, our sister publication, which you've allowed us to plug before. We've got a piece coming up on crude and how analysts in the oil market are making critical mistakes by not incorporating what's truly transpired as a result of the shale boom. We've got a piece coming up on Saskatchewan, as a potential target for Trump's ferocious appetite for, geopolitical power moves. And then I just turned in another piece today, which is a fun one where we debunk the whole concept of data centers in space. So that'll be a fun one too. So David, always a pleasure. Great to be on with you again. Doomberg.com and classicsreadaloud.com. Thanks again, and looking forward to talking to you in 2026.
Data centers in space sounds like a fun topic. We can probably visit that at another time. Thank you very much for your contributions this year in 2025, Doomberg. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your insights. See you in 2026. Happy New Year.
Same to you, brother.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Follow Doomberg. Links down below.